multi-level structures, and where if you put it too high, you might see bleed on the top floor, and you may not realize it because you're testing on the first floor, everything looks great, you move on, and then what if you don't make it to the spot on the floor above, and you're seeing the beacon from the on the first floor. So that could break the use case. But if you look at a convenience store, if you want to detect presence, 1, maybe 2 beacons gives you, okay, I know when they walk in the store. Versus are they looking at soda or candy? At that level it becomes, okay, you need more specificity and more granularity. And now, first of all, you're adding time to reconfigure each one of these beacons, and tomorrow if your use case changes, that means you have to send someone back out to reconfigure them again.
Yeah, and you just broken the first use case. So
exactly, that allows them to scale. Because when you're thinking about, hey, I'm going to install beacons across 8,000 locations, you're not going to be able to visit 8,000 locations.
It's a planning, placement, propagation, procurement, permission, privacy or public notices, process, presentation, and people. Welcome to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Ecosystem. My name is Steve Statler of Statler Consulting, and we're doing this show in partnership with our friends at Proxbook. And this week we're back at Gimbal. We're not talking to the CEO, we're actually talking to someone who is intimately involved in most of the deployments that get done at Gimbal, and the subject of today's show is all about deployment. So why is deployment interesting? It's interesting because it's a critical success factor, and arguably you're going to spend more money on the deployment of beacons than you will on the beacon hardware itself. So getting it right is really key, and I'm really pleased to be with Sid, and Sid's full name I will attempt to pronounce, Siddharth Panigrahi. I know that's not quite right, but hopefully close enough. Sid, thanks very much for doing the show.
Pleasure. Nice to speak to you again, Steve.
Yeah, so we used to work together at Qualcomm. You were an engineer, so that meant you were right at the top of the heap. So Qualcomm is run by engineers and lawyers and business development people, and strategists are fairly low down along with the maintenance staff. But so your background's engineering, and you did a lot of the beacon deployments when we were Qualcomm, and now your role, I think when Gimbal was first formed, am I right in saying, was you were director of essentially customer engineering?
That is correct.
And now you're director of...
Yeah, so I was involved in a lot of the deployments we did when we were within Qualcomm and after we spun out, and then now I've moved into more of the sales engineering role, so I get involved much earlier on, which actually helps me shape some of the discussions as well, before, while things are being decided, including beacon deployments, use cases, how many beacons are needed, how it's going to be implemented or, rolled out. So that definitely helps me shape and helps us, influence and hopefully avoid things that we've seen people trip across in the past.
So you can sell and design for deployment considerations.
Correct.
As well as talking about speeds and feeds and stuff. So how many deployments do you think you've been involved in?
A lot. I don't have a number, but we've done, at Gimbal, we've done, as you know, we've deployed across a large variety of locations. I don't have a number to tell you, but yeah, hey, it's more than 5, 10, 20, 30, probably, more than 50.
And can you talk about the kinds of deployment, any names that you can share, or at least industries where you've worked?
Sure, we obviously, we've done a lot of sports, stadiums and venues, over 60 or 70 plus stadiums in the US itself. We've done the Super Bowl 3 years in a row. Citibank, came out publicly also with some of the cool stuff we're doing with them. So that's some of the stuff that's happened in the last year and a half as such. So yeah, it's been sports venues, gas stations, as you're aware of.
Yes, indeed. We've stood on gas station forecourts together and figured out how to get the beacons to distinguish between pump 1 and pump 2, which is quite challenging, but possible. So, well, that's cool. So who... we're going to use a structure that we used in the book, and one thing I should say is you are the Gimbal contributor to the book in terms of the deployment chapter, which I think is a fantastic chapter, so thanks very much. And the thing that makes it good is it's actually informed by real practical experiences that you've got and the folks at Point Inside had. And we used a 10P structure for the chapter. So the 10 Ps, I'm going to have to look at my notes, are planning, placement, propagation, procurement, permission, privacy or public notices, process, presentation, and people. So that kind of gives you a sense of all of the things that people need to think about when they're deploying. It's not just a matter of just sticking a couple of beacons up.
Yeah.
Especially when you get to a large stadium or even a network of stores and so forth. So actually, let's jump to the end, because I think it's interesting to talk about people. Who is it that actually puts the beacons up in a big deployment? Is it you in a van going around to 10,000 fast food stores, or how does it work?
So yeah, it can vary. In most cases, at least with our enterprise customers, folks who are looking to install beacons across the country in hundreds or thousands of locations, it typically the most effective way, and also that cost effective, and in terms of doing it right, is to work with internal teams who do who work on putting existing infrastructure in those locations, like it will be store ops, or people who are putting maybe sometimes access points or point of sale machines in those locations. We typically work with our customers to help train their internal teams, who is then in turn going to manage the logistics of this is we'll work with them to build a training document on how to train, because on each one of these locations you're not necessarily going to have an expert who knows everything about beacons and RF devices. It's going to be a person who's proficient enough to see a piece of paper, follow instructions, and then also understand some basics of why are these devices going in and what do they serve, what purpose do they serve.
Which really takes us to the first P, which is process, and having it really planned out to make it
correct.
Dead simple.
Yep, because and planning starts right when folks start looking at beacons, is to before you can get to how many beacons are needed, where to place them, what's the use case, how do typically also what large customers do is you start with the beacon deployment that you can build upon. So today it might be X number of beacons, and tomorrow you might scale to 3X or 5X, but you just start with I can now reuse these beacons to now advance my use cases and build upon them, versus I need to restructure the whole deployment because it was so specific to a use case.
So you need to think in advance, because the placement of the beacon is driven by the use case that you're implementing.
Absolutely.
And don't just think ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, time to time, and it happens more frequently than you would think, is typically you'll get questions where here's the stadium, how many beacons do I need? And the question back is, well, that's a difficult question to answer, because that solely depends on the use case. In some cases, there are scenarios where someone's trying to put beacons in this space because they want to be able to offer it to different types of clients. Maybe it's a convention center that wants beacons and they really don't know the use case, but they want high level beacon coverage so they can cater it to different conventions, different conferences that happens in the space. So in that, we typically work with them to determine, do you want to detect presence in the area, where you just want to know that people are in this general area, might be a particular section of the convention center, or do you want to get very specific that they're at a specific concession stand? And typically it's a combination of those two. And so we'll work in some spaces where it's fairly generic beacon install, where the use cases may not be defined because there might be no use cases. It might be someone looking ahead to upgrade their existing infrastructure to allow for companies that hold events there to be able to use beacons. It's similar to I'm setting up Wi-Fi for the venue. I just need coverage.
So if you have a really good idea of what your use case, maybe the number of beacons is going to be smaller, but if you want a lot of flexibility, you're going to have a lot more beacons, because you just got to cover all eventualities.
Sure, exactly. I mean, again, when the use cases are specific, that obviously makes it slightly easier. With beacons, you always have the scenarios where these are radio frequency devices, so every physical location will have its own slight variations. So we again work with the customer to come to a general plan of placement where this will work across 95% of your locations. Maybe the 5% might be one-offs or slightly different scenarios, but we work with them to generalize a plan that allows them to scale. Because when you're thinking about I'm going to install beacons across 8,000 locations, you're not going to be able to visit 8,000 locations. You typically pick, let's see, there's 10 different types of layouts that cover 95% of these.
So you'll actually visit a representative set of
Correct.
locations, and
Correct.
sometimes these fast food places, they kind of have different models
Exactly.
of store. We have
Exactly.
a Model A store, Model B
Yep.
store, the upmarket, the
Exactly.
small.
Exactly.
So you do a site survey. How do you approach the site survey? What do
So
you
the
do?
site survey is, typically we have a starting use case or a set of use cases. Let's say, hey, these are the, minimum requirements that need to be met. Site surveys help us determine, we have some rough guidelines, learnings already from what to expect. Meaning, hey, you place a beacon here. I know what to expect when I need to target someone on if it's a tap to the beacon use case, or if it's I want to capture users within 5 to 10 feet, or just capture anyone who I see, which could be within this 35, 50 feet area. Site survey allows us to zoom in on if it's a quick service restaurant. Okay, this is what it means to capture people at the drive-through or the entrance. So it allows us to run some quick testing with the tools we provide.
Mm-hmm.
But it might just be temporarily placing beacon at different locations. Site survey also helps where you get to speak with either the manager on site or someone who runs the physical location, because different types of places may have different sensitivity
Right.
to, hey, is the beacon visible? Is it not visible? Can we put it on a wall which already has some noise so that it doesn't stand out? Versus, hey, some people might not care. They might be like, it's fine to put the beacon here. It's a drive-through. No one is necessarily looking out for a beacon.
So is the site survey essential? Because I imagine that costs money. You have to stay in the 5-star hotel, have the big expense account, the expensive steak dinners. Do people try and avoid the site survey? Is that permissible?
It's of late. I think people now understand clearly that it is essential because of the fact that, again, with beacons, it's not like, hey, we installed it in one stadium, so now every stadium in the world can just follow these guidelines, right? So people see the value, and hey, if you are investing in beacons or location to be a core part of your mobile app or technology stack, hey, it's good to do it right. The small investment in the site survey helps them understand exactly what they need for their space. And as I said, in the site survey, it may not just be for a specific use case. It also understands them to have guidelines or notes for, hey, when they decide to scale later.
Right.
Today we have 50 beacons, tomorrow we're going to have 100. If we have 300, they've already spent the time and investment, effort to go look at their physical site and see, hey, how do beacons behave in their physical space.
Do you need a floor plan? Is that essential?
Floor plans is sometimes useful, definitely, right, to especially at least, if you're having very initial discussions on how many beacons may be needed, how does the space look, it does come in handy, especially for, again, things like convention centers or museums, especially, in some cases, the museum, hey, something might be being built, right, it's not yet ready, so we start off with a floor plan to get a gist of, okay, how would a beacon install look like, or at least estimate, give them a ballpark. But most times, a site survey is what gives them the most information they need.
And I'm imagining, again, it comes back to the use case. If you just want to know presence, is the person in the store, maybe you don't need a floor plan for that.
Exactly.
But if you want wayfinding, then it's like you got to have the plan.
Exactly, right. If you look at a convenience store, if you want to detect presence, 1, maybe 2 beacons gives you, okay, I know when they walk in the store. Versus are they looking at soda or candy? Hey, at that level, it becomes, okay, you need more specificity and more granular detail.
And typically, where do you get that floor plan from?
That's also, typically store ops will have it. Store ops or operations teams who are managing these locations would have it. Things can get interesting because you get into some scenarios where it's franchise owned. You may not even have store plans, or you may not have up-to-date store plans. Things change, so that's why a floor plan is not exactly like a must-have. It's very useful, but typically, if you at least you can say, okay, these 3 or 4 sites will cover our bulk of our locations nationwide or worldwide, then that definitely is more helpful to get them.
So we've been talking about planning, and that's kind of getting a sense of what are the use cases, doing some sizing exercises driven by numbers. Anything else you want to say on sizing? Anything that goes into that sizing equation?
Yeah, part of planning, I think you have some notes which we'll discuss later as well, is part of planning is that you're having a buy-in or having clear communication to even folks who might be working in the location, who might not be necessarily involved in the digital strategy for the organization. It's just conveying, hey, this is what beacons are for, this is what they're going to help achieve. And it's you need buy-in from even those physical location owners, because hey, it's motivation for them as well to
Yeah.
okay, I need to spend some energy and time installing these beacons, making sure it's done right.
Okay, so we've got our floor plan, we've done our site survey, we know what the use cases are, we've come up with an estimate that's driven by the use cases, and the people, maybe you for proof of concept, but more likely to be store ops. What about third parties? I remember that's one of the areas we looked at. Are we seeing third party companies that will do this? Because you don't have 500 people in vans at Gimbal.
Absolutely. We are seeing third parties as well. We typically work with enterprise customers. They will always have a list of authorized third parties that are already in their vendor management system, that are approved vendors to do other things in the store. We will help train them because it keeps costs down for them, and it's an existing vendor versus getting completely someone new on board. So we'll work with them as well, to help train them, and then at that point it helps them because now they have all the knowledge with their third-party vendors. So tomorrow, say phase 1, they decided to go to 500 locations. Phase 2 is 2,000. Now their third-party vendor has all the information needed to now go and do the work for them.
So if you've got someone who's doing maintenance on the point of sale system, might as well have them do this as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got people, we've got planning. What about placement? How do you figure out where to put these things?
So that's interesting, right? So as I said, some of it can significantly depend on the type of location. Hey, if it's a really nice museum, you just can't go put sticking beacons in the wall, versus for a quick service restaurant, or they may be less sensitive to the visibility of the beacon itself. As a rule of thumb, we actually almost always recommend, beacons are not devices that need to stand out and be in the face of the consumer. They're serving a purpose. So typically we always try and find spaces that will be less intrusive with the physical space. We'll look for spaces that there's already noise on the wall, as we would say. There's either access points, alarm fire alarm, some other stuff that is also always on the walls. Again, primarily driven by use case. What's the use case? Because that's the primary incentive is to do it right, is to will it meet my use case, and then it's looking at sensitivity around the place. Maybe it's an historical place, maybe it's nice and it's a VIP suite. You're not going to go put a beacon that is going to stand out. Right.
So this is really getting onto another P, which is presentation, and part of presentation is, do I have to hide these things?
Correct.
So with placement, let's just drill down into that a little bit more.
Sure.
So let's talk about ceilings, because I have this client, they've got a warehouse, the ceilings are 30 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
Can I stick my beacons in the 30 feet above everyone, and it's out of everyone's way? No one's going to be stealing those things up there. So that's got to be a factor. How can I keep them out of people's sticky mitts? Because you have them too low, people are going to steal them. But is 30 feet too high?
Correct.
Is there such a thing as too high?
It is. There is such a thing as too high, and it actually especially gets interesting where you go to multi-level structures, and where if you put it too high, you might see bleed on the top floor, and you may not realize it because you're testing on the first floor, everything looks great, you move on, and then what if you don't make it to the spot on the floor above, and you're seeing the beacon from the on the first floor? So that could break the use case practically. So there is something called as too high. Typically we recommend beacons, installing beacons about 7 to 8 or 10 feet high at the most. Don't go too high. That allows you to detect presence of the user within that location with good accuracy, and it also helps prevent bleed. Now, you might not always be able to avoid bleed just because of the nature of the physical location. That's when we get into things like, you might increase the density of beacons, because you might create a denser beacons, coverage in a particular area, so that at some point it doesn't matter if I see more than one beacon, or if I see beacons from the other area, if I can create a signal density that allows me to differentiate between areas. And in the platform we also provide a way where for different areas you can specify the density at which someone has to see the beacon for them to be recognized that they are there. So that allows them to get away with, hey, it doesn't matter if I'm in the kids department and I'm seeing beacons from men's apparel, for example. The density of the kids department beacons are significantly higher So I'm just going to ignore those other beacons I see.
So this is really where the value add comes in from your beacon
Correct.
supplier. It's not enough to just say, oh, I'm going to use the native iBeacon signal, because
Exactly.
life's more complicated than that.
Absolutely, right? I mean, it's not enough to say that if I see this beacon, I can assume I'm here.
Right.
Because in a physical space, you might always see more than the, beacons from other areas in the store. And that's why the way we built it was to handle it in the software. Because another way of doing it is you could go and reconfigure each beacon to reduce its range. That doesn't scale because now, first of all, you're adding time to reconfigure each one of these beacons, and tomorrow if your use case changes, that means you have to send someone back out to reconfigure them again.
Yeah, and you just broken the first use case. So
Exactly.
better to have higher the full broadcast volume, as it were, and deal with it in software. What about, do you find people steal beacons? Is that a problem? Do you have to worry about like securing them so that people don't do that?
We've seen a couple of odd cases. It's not that more than stealing per se. It might be someone grabbed it because they didn't know what it was, and at that point it's just an unknown device, which may be a security threat, which may be just someone thinking, hey, what's this device for? So it's I don't know if it's stealing their beacon because it's but we have seen beacons sort of disappear.
Right.
And so that's also another reason why we would recommend it, keep it out of reach. We do have things in the platform that allow our customers to know when a beacon has moved.
Okay.
So they can actually tag the beacon with a particular location, and then if it's being sighted by devices in a completely different location, that can be a flag for them that this doesn't look right.
Okay, let's move on to our next P, which is propagation.
Yep.
Which is like one of the trickier things, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's like, on one hand, I mean, people always talk about, oh, what's the range of this beacon? Like, that's the only problem. But actually, that isn't the only problem. The problem is actually almost too much range and
That is correct.
signals bouncing around.
That is
How do you
correct.
deal with that?
Yeah, so that's what that's why site survey is so important, because you might have tested a beacon in a lab and what to expect at different distances from the beacon, but that same beacon might look completely different in a sports stadium and might look completely different in a retail store and a quick service restaurant. That's where site survey comes in, is because you have concrete, metal, steel, you have all these structural materials that will impact how a beacon is seen by devices. And so that's with site survey, it allows us to cater it to a specific place or a type of place, not even a specific place, and come up with recommendations. And in some cases, it doesn't happen as often, but in some cases it may be that, hey, the use case needs to be adjusted because the physical location does not allow that that use case to be implemented, because it may not be possible to get that level of signal propagation that you intended to.
And do you have tools and techniques you can use to actually shape the signal? Is that viable?
So we have tools to sort of measure the signal strength that allows someone to capture some notes and enter it into the system for reference on how the app is going to behave. We have seen some people get innovative as well, trying to shape, putting them in metal boxes to sort of block off signal on the sides so that they can shape the signal. The beacons themselves also, the gimbal beacons themselves do also have a optional software selectable antenna, which is directional antenna versus the default omnidirectional antenna, which is useful in some scenarios as well. So we have seen cases like someone's trying to put them in the gas pump and they want to avoid signal going on as fuel dispenser 1 and 2 on each side, and they want different beacons for each, depending on which side of the pump you are. So that also we have seen.
I do remember trips to Home Depot to make that use case work, and it worked. The switch box from Home Depot
Absolutely.
actually allowed us to separate one side of the pump from the other pump. And I think one of my favorite images in the book is actually a picture of a donut, a real donut, because I couldn't afford to buy the fancy picture from an electrical engineer of the shape of the beacon signal. But I think it's worth pointing out to people what we say omnidirectional, but it's not a perfect circle, is it?
It's not a perfect
And what are the
circle.
implications of that?
Correct. I mean, it's not a perfect circle, and as I said, some of it will always depend on the actual physical space. Sometimes folk think like, hey, if I'll place the beacon here, I'm just going to capture everyone in front of the beacon. You might not realize you might be capturing people, especially in a retail scenario where there's departments and things all around the beacon. So it's not not exactly just someone standing in front of the beacon. The beacon itself by default is omnidirectional, where it's literally all around the beacon, but there may be some dead spots, and that's what you need to test for. And that's why
if you're pointing the whole of the donut and you think, oh, this is great, I'm like firing like on Star Trek, this phaser beam, it just doesn't work like that, and you may need to adjust by 90 degrees or whatever so that the signal actually is going
or sometimes putting it in a concrete ball might help, because at that point you're practically you're blocking off the signal from spilling sort of behind the beacon. So that is also, again, depends on the physical space. We usually recommend different things that will work for the use case.
And so let's talk briefly about the impact of materials.
Sure.
What can you run through very quickly what the impact is of different kinds of materials on beacon signals?
Sure. I mean, typically, you see things like glass. Glass is okay.
Yeah.
Normal glass, if it's really thick security level glass, that can be a problem, but normal glass is typically okay.
Maybe if it's got a metallic tint, that could be a problem.
That could be a problem. Wood is also typically okay. You don't see, necessarily issues with it. Concrete is signal is not going to go through concrete, so that you have to keep in mind.
Which could be a good thing. None of this is good or bad. It's just understanding what's going to happen.
Yeah. Metal is interesting as well. Metal is one of the more challenging things, is because in some scenarios it might break a use case because you might have reflection of signal all over the place, and now you have unintended consequences. Versus sometimes you can choose a location where the whole structure can become an antenna for you because of the metal characteristics, and that might work in your favor. So it all depends on the space. But typically things like wood, glass, or another rule of thumb is if light can shine through, that usually is going to be okay. Your beacon signal is going to shine, come through, and you'll be able to see the beacon.
All right, very good. We could talk a lot more on this. We won't, but it's a really interesting set of problems to solve. Let's talk about a problem that maybe this is trivial, maybe it isn't, but we put it in the book, which was procurement, and I just wanted to sensitize people to thinking ahead and not expecting that you can figure out who your beacon vendor is and then expect them to deliver 10,000 beacons within a couple of weeks. That's probably not a good idea.
Yeah, so procurement is, another thing that we do, which, a lot of enterprise customers expect is, as you said, typically it doesn't work where we're just sending 20,000 beacons to a warehouse and then they have to take care of labeling each one of these, putting them in separate boxes, sending them to different locations. So we actually do that for our customers. While we are working with them in the site survey and initial phases, deciding how deployment is going to look like, then we structure with them, how many beacons per site. We will even typically label them so that someone on the site receiving the beacons has clear guidelines on, hey, this says entrance, this says apparel, or whatever that is. We typically also work on an instruction, one pager, which says what the beacon is for. Images are the best, work better than even writing simple instructions. This is what a beacon does, this is how it looks, this is how to operate a beacon. Folks who do it best will also invest and put some information on their intranet sites so that where the store ops people can go and log in, and maybe there's a brief tutorial or brief explanation on what these devices are. Typically they'll also hold internal webinars to explain their teams about, hey, what are these new devices and how they're going to be a critical part of their strategy moving forward. So in terms of procurement, we would build these things we call as beacon kits, which would go to different locations, which would include, all the beacons would be labeled, and it would include a 1 or 2 pager instruction sheet, which typically have some images which will tell them how to place these beacons.
So all this takes time. So advance notice, because if there's you just shouldn't assume that all the beacons are going to be available, period.
Correct.
And you also need to think about the delivery and the supply chain and all that preparation.
And when you're sending it to so many locations, even installation, you have to give yourself some buffer, because not everyone, while you can communicate that this is a priority, everyone at the physical location, the associates or managers, they're not going to just jump at the chance of, I got my beacons, I'm going to go place them. Right. They have other things to sort through, so I have to build in some buffer time at, this may be installed over a period of 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Yeah. Right? That could also take time.
We could riff on that, but it's a real eye-opener. You realize that technology isn't the top of everyone's priority list, and they don't necessarily love the opportunity to play with this stuff. You've got to think about that, and that's really kind of touches on one of the soft issues that we've got. One of the 10 P's is permission.
Yep.
So I think, in an ideal world, you'd kind of get the order from your client and you'd ship the beacons to the site and they get installed and everything's okay. But actually, you have to ask permission from not just one person, maybe quite a few. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And permissions gets more, I'll use the word interesting when you installing in public places. Maybe it's transit areas, because at that point, you might have real world. Hey, you might be speaking to security people. You have people regarding the site or police. You have to make sure you have the right paperwork, you have the right permissions. That's why communication is key as well. Even when you're going into a retail store, as I said, they have other priorities and other challenges on hand that they have to solve. So it's always good to that some prior communication has been done, or you have the right contacts, which, hey, maybe it's a name they recognize, that hey, Steve has given us approval, this is an email or this is some documents, and they know who Steve is, for example.
Yeah.
Right? It definitely helps to have that level of, the lesser explaining you have to do on site, the easier your life becomes.
Yeah, and I think some clients they'll already be on top of that. Others,
Absolutely.
You may need to prompt. And one of the things that struck me was sometimes this can even get up to board level. Talking about an airport which is run by a bunch of politicians, they probably need to know that there are these beacons going in, because what if some press person makes a big deal over the privacy? And so it's kind of pre-briefing
Exactly.
the political stakeholders you've got, and that means also marketing and PR.
Absolutely. Yep.
And the janitorial staff, the security staff. I mean, it's just a huge list.
That is correct. Yeah, and for example, if you're installing something at the Super Bowl where a lot of stuff is happening over a day or 2 day time period, because hey, they actually literally have a couple of days to put up all the infrastructure for a whole week-long event. There are multiple vendors in the space doing work. It's good to have the right paperwork to show anyone. It's a high security event, high visibility event. So it's important to have the right paperwork and the right information to show as to why these devices are going up in the space.
Very good. What about public notices? Are we and we actually just had our session on privacy, but I'd love to, we've had the lawyer's answer to this. We'll see if the feet on the street agree with the lawyer. Do you think that we should be putting notices up like we do for closed circuit TV cameras, letting people know that there are beacons around, or is that going over the top?
That may or may not be essential, primarily because the beacons themselves, unlike security cameras, the beacons themselves are still more or less, at least to a large extent, reliant on someone installing an app.
Yes.
Which has already conveyed to them the kind of information that is being captured if a device spots a beacon. The beacon itself is not necessarily capturing information about the users in the space, right? The beacon is transmitting information. So if the mobile app has the privacy policies covered, that usually will take care of it. The notice part may only come in again in maybe public transit areas where, hey, at that point, it's not necessarily a location owned by a private party here. It's a public location, so that might be more useful from a security standpoint to just have we've seen things done like, hey, if it's a label on the beacon which says for any questions visit a website or call this number. That also works sometimes, where you can just put a label on the beacon if someone has questions around that beacon, or you could put privacy notices. But typically, a label will help, just achieve that. Or, as I said, in most cases, and it's dependent on an app. So if an app has clearly conveyed that, you may get away without having public notices.
But that is an interesting point. The bar may be higher if it's a public place rather than a private place.
Correct, exactly.
Let's talk about process.
Yep.
It seems pretty simple. You have your beacon, you stick it on the wall, job done. But actually, you talked about you touched on this when you said we might label a beacon and tell them where to put it. And we talked in the book about, I think, 3 different approaches to this, variations of planning it in advance and telling people where to put it, putting the beacon up, and then saying where you recorded. There's some permutations here. Is there a right way of doing it?
So the best way is always, and the best way doesn't always happen, but the best way is always, after the site survey, you work with the operations teams to define what their, the associates or the managers, the folks at the locations are comfortable with in terms of a process that has been followed previously. to either install existing infrastructure or do some work that was done across all locations. So you work with them to cater to a language that everyone can, it'll be comfortable for everyone to understand. And then you would label them. We have things in the system where we would tag them with the location, so it allows owners to know. Because at the end of the day, you can put the labels you want, you can send the document, but it's humans installing these, and you can't necessarily prevent someone from installing a beacon mistakenly in the wrong place, right? So we do have some things in the system that allows folks to also know if a beacon is being sited at the wrong location. But typically, label itself and the instructions and the webinars helps achieve, at least get as much accuracy as possible.
Right. And I think the last P is presentation. So that would be our 10th P. We've talked about this a little bit, but where do you see people on the spectrum of let's make this beacon disappear, a la Apple, which, there's no secret, they're gimbal beacons in the Apple store, and most gimbal beacons are white, but those ones are silver. So we've seen that. I've heard the folks at Estimote argue you want to make these things really stand out because that means that everyone knows that it's a beacon. And then the other thing that I'm starting to see is people actually putting their own brand on there, like the London Underground logos on there.
Sure.
What are you seeing as far as where are people coming down on? Do they want something that's discreet or?
Mostly people are, you look at them as mostly as I said, beacons go in places where they're not necessarily standing out to folks. With that said, in some scenarios, if it's a nice looking concert venue or if it's a historic space, they would want even the minor details like, hey, I want the beacon paint to match the paint of the wall it's going on, which we have, which has happened in the past as well. So we would, people can paint those beacons because the beacons can be painted, no problem at all, as long as you don't use any metallic paint there.
Yeah, that would be really bad.
But they can be painted. We've seen folks put stickers. As I said, for public areas, it actually works out great if you put a sticker because then it looks, it's official equipment, whom to contact. We've seen folks put, we also allow, for different beacons, you actually can specify a contact point. So you might have an email address of the manager of an area distributor, so you know whom to call for questions. So branding them at some level does help with more about, hey, if someone has questions around the device, because at the end of the day, it's a box, it's a device sitting there. Mm-hmm. As I said, the more magic is in the software and the app. So we haven't necessarily, seen people wanting to make them pretty. Mm-hmm. Because when you go to any location, there's so much physical noise in the space. The beacon itself is not the one that is going to glorify the place. The beacon is again there to serve a purpose for the whole digital experience for the users in that space.
Well, we've covered a lot. We've talked about planning, placement, propagation, procurement, permission, privacy, process, presentation, and people. That's pretty good. Did we miss anything out?
No, and I think, as much as it, sometimes it's always best, the one thing we always say is test, and test. Like anything, you're rolling out a new, feature in your app, you're putting beacons in the space. App developer is not always talking to the person who's putting the beacons, is not always, probably not talking to the owner in the space who is dealing with, hey, this is the flow of people I see, this is how people navigate in the space. But some of that is also important to know. There's multiple ways to get in, how do people navigate in the space. So that's why, testing is important, so that, especially for, in some cases for, for sports events or concerts, you might not have too many chances to get it right. If it's a conference, it might just be a weekend event. If it's a sports, if it's the NFL, you have 8 home games a season typically. So hey, you might not have too many chances to get it right. So it's always best to run some tests, distribute at least a test version of the app as soon as possible to someone on site who can run on their device, confirm expected behavior, so that you don't see any surprises when it's prime time, when it's time to go live. Those
are a couple of good points there. So there's an interaction between the logistics, the placement, and the software developer, isn't there?
Correct.
That's probably there's going to be mistakes, and that's Absolutely. Why you need to do the testing. So that's a really good point. The other thing that I didn't think of is the Super Bowl versus the McDonald's deployment. You probably want to you can't have someone from your beacon supplier on site probably at every McDonald's, but
That's correct.
you probably want to have someone on site at the Super Bowl, don't you?
Exactly, because again, as I said, short events. Hey, you want to get it right. You might not get the second chance. It's always best to have someone who understands the whole technology on stack to provide you with some feedback. Again, hopefully the testing has happened before the person is on site, because that also has its own challenges of fixing it with the App Store reviews. That can take time to make updates. But yeah, testing absolutely gives you the best chance of success.
So I hope, if nothing else, we've convinced people that there's actually quite a lot to getting this right. It's the area where you can end up spending a lot of money just because people are involved, and it's an area that's absolutely critical to the success of the project. So I think that's a great advert for making sure that your beacon vendor has got loads of experience, and so that's another thing to think about when you're selecting your beacon vendor.
Absolutely.
Okay, Sid, you've been really generous. Thank you
you
very much for your time. I know you're super busy, and I think I'd love to get feedback from people that are watching. If anyone's made it to the end, we'd love to hear from you. There's lots of experience out there. Share your experience with us. Give us your feedback, and if you have been, thanks for watching.
Thank you.
All right. You're not really into music much?
I'm not. I listen to music. Growing up in Mumbai, I listened to mostly Bollywood music. But,
oh, really?
But now, yeah, I have a big sports buff. So if I had to pick something to carry with me, it probably will be some sports videos that I treasure. Either it's my favorite team, Arsenal, or the Indian cricket team, for example.
Well, the Arsenal have made some records in the past. I'm just trying to think back, because I used to live next to the Arsenal football ground, and they do a lot of singing there. So
yeah. And it is in the past, unfortunately, now. They haven't been doing well the last few years, but now, yeah.
Okay, well, so some sports videos and maybe the Arsenal Football Club singing the Arsenal anthem,
there you go.
Whatever that is.
Yep.
My memory of them is having riot police and Alsatian dogs barking, so that's my audio memory of that. Okay.